Good evening, and welcome to the Everhart Museum's first virtual Curators Tour. I'm Don Fredrickson, and I'm President of the Board of Trustees here at the Everhart Museum. Tonight, drawing from the strengths of the Everhart's permanent collection, our curatorial staff will guide you to the new exhibit, Eyes on America. This exhibit showcases traditional and unconventional symbols of Americana. While viewing, ask yourself, how and why did certain images become associated with America? We will be taking a handful of questions throughout the tour. To submit a question, please use the chat feature on the YouTube event page. Tonight's event is a give as you wish. If you wish to donate any amount, please click the link in the chat feature or visit our website at www.everhart-museum.org. Your donations will support future exhibitions and programs here at the museum. Lastly, I'd like to thank our exhibit sponsors, PNC Bank, and our media partner, Posture Interactive. To begin our tonight's program, I'd like to introduce you to Michael Wisniewski, our Gallery and Collections Manager here at the Everhart Museum. Mike?
Hi everybody. To start off, I'm going to talk about this poster here. This is James Montgomery Flagg's depiction of Uncle Sam. Flagg was a comic book artist and illustrator born in Kentucky in 1877. He's best known for this drawing of Uncle Sam, a character who serves as the embodiment of the United States federal government. This illustration debuted as a newspaper ad in 1916. Though the character of Uncle Sam had existed for over 100 years at that point, Flagg's version of him crystallized his appearance in the popular imagination the following year when the United States Army distributed 4 million copies of his poster to help recruitment efforts during the First World War. Our copy was used at that time for that reason, as it has stamped along the bottom the location of the recruiting station that was a public square in Wilkes-Barre at the time. So that's all on this one, and then I'm going to turn over to Melanie here, who's going to talk about our child with Flag.
So folk art portraits like this one gained popularity in the 1800s. Although they did exist prior to that, they were almost completely reserved for wealthy and upper-class citizens. But after an increase in population in the Northeast around 1820, the middle class grew and prompted a new class of people to begin commissioning their portraits to be painted. They wanted themselves and their families to be documented in paintings for a number of reasons. Most apparently, the middle class citizens wanted to flaunt and validate their newly discovered social standing by co-opting something reserved for the rich. Another explanation for the uptick in portraits and the inclusion of symbols is that the increase in population created a surge of patriotism among the middle class, which could be why the American flag is so prominent in this portrait. The increase of patriotism at the time was not only caused by population, but a collective pride among families who had conquered the journey to the Northeast. While we find a great variety in the people depicted in folk art portraiture, ranging from families on their farmland to political figures and prominent community members, we find an astounding amount of similarities in the way that they are painted. Notice the small facial features, disproportionate body parts, and more specifically, the rounded hands and wrists in this piece. These features can be found in nearly all folk art portraiture. I think we have a question, so let's go over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Mel. So our first question comes from Nancy, and she asks, why does she have a more adult-looking face?
So an interesting thing about folk artists is by nature they're completely untrained and self-taught, which does not devalue their work, but does create depictions unrealistic to how we see things in real life. So unlike when we look at a figure painted by an old master, for example, who would have extensive training on how to depict a face that is proportionate to something we'd see in real life, folk artists had to teach themselves as they went, and this results in a lot of disproportionate figures and especially facial features. I think that's all the questions we have, so we're going to go over to Francesca in the Native American room next.
This next series of objects that we'll look at are going to explore how Native American culture has been appropriated as an American symbol. So this piece that we'll be taking a look at is entitled Bicentennial Indian, and is a print that was created by an artist named Fritz Schulder as part of the Kent Bicentennial Portfolio. The Kent Bicentennial Portfolio was a collection of 12 prints by prominent contemporary artists that responded to a prompt about how to create an image that represented what independence meant to them. This print is actually based on historic events. So it was based on events where Plains Indians in the 1800s would be given surplus American flags from reservation commissaries to be worn in addition to their traditional clothing. Ironically, it shows this Native American in a similar way as most Americans might envision Betsy Ross, sitting with a flag draped over her lap. The artist's personal life was also greatly impacted in this work as well. Schulder was raised white but had Native American heritage and struggled with this dual identity. Schulder's print at its core really depicts some serious issues such as poverty and cultural clashes. Native Americans often encountered having to deal with these issues as being a problem to be dealt with, but also being a symbol that is authentically American. Next, we'll take a look at another few pieces that go in depth to explore this. But first, I think we have a question. Stephanie?
We do have another question. And please feel free to ask any questions you'd like in the chat feature. This question is, what are some of the other Kent Bicentennial pieces in the collection?
That's a great question. So the Kent Bicentennial Portfolio is a series of 12 prints. The Everhart is one of the institutions that actually has a collection of all of those, and they also are included in many other institutions around the country. We have several of these images on display in Eyes on America by artists such as Alex Katz, Audrey Flack, and Jacob Lawrence that we'll be able to see in a little bit with one of our next speakers. So if there's no other questions, I think we'll head on to our next object. So here you can see 3 wooden sculptures. These are known as cigar store Indians. So cigar store Indians, like the one shown here, are popular symbols of the tobacco trade during the 1800s and 1900s. And they were used as advertisements outside of shops that would sell tobacco products. You might even recognize them because some of them are still used at shops today. Native Americans became the subject of these sculptures because they were associated with introducing the first colonizers to the tobacco crop in the Americas. The most common statues, however, depict stereotypes of Native Americans, often generalizing what a Native American would wear, usually depicting a feather skirt, a headdress, as you can see with all 3 of these, as well as moccasins or other clothing pieces. So the example all the way over across from me is referred to as a special type of cigar store Indian known as a Virginian. So you'll probably notice that the features of this sculpture are a little different than the 2 others. So the piece would have been made by someone who had never actually seen a Native American before, but likely owned African slaves. So the features are more aligned with a black male slave, while the clothing is more stereotypically indigenous. Today, these types of sculptures communicate a more complicated history of prejudice against indigenous peoples and appropriation of indigenous culture and identity. With that, now we're going to head to a message from our sponsor, PNC.
The closure of our schools and places of employment taught us one thing, it's that we are resilient. When put to the test, we try new things, and so far I'm happy to report the staff of the Everhart have succeeded. Hello, I am Kathy Bell, Director of Development for the Everhart Museum. Tonight as we launch our virtual Curators Tour, a Give As You Wish event, I want to take this opportunity to say thank you. Thank you to those who watched a video, commented on a thread, participated in a virtual class, joined a virtual happy hour, all of those who continue to show support. And thank you to PNC for their sponsorship of this exhibit. It is true this year, by keeping our belts tight, we are okay. Like most nonprofits, what about next year and the year after that? That is why I'm here tonight to say we need your help. Your contribution will support the museum's general operating expenses, or if directed, a program or specific exhibit. Please show your support today, and thank you for entrusting us to care for this remarkable building and the thousands of pieces of art and artifacts. You can donate tonight by visiting support@everhart-museum.org. I hope you enjoy the tour.
Okay, next we have 3 lithographs by an artist named Eugene Morley. He was a printmaker and muralist born in North Scranton in 1909. Educated at the PA Academy of Arts and the National Academy in New York. Following graduation from there, he stayed in Manhattan but frequently returned to Scranton to take inspiration from the area's industrial landscape, or what fellow Scranton artist Frederick Knight called the mine spectacle. He is often focused on the various horrors of the mining industry. During the Great Depression, he was a rostered artist for the Federal Art Project, part of the Works Progress Administration, which was President Roosevelt's plan to get Americans back to work during that financial crisis. He was employed by the FAP, or while employed by the FAP, he created this lithograph entitled Hard Coal Country as an illustration for New Masses magazine, which is the official publication of the American Marxist Party. And it's this one here, and it depicts the collapse of a mine on top of an already collapsed mine, with company houses and a coal breaker looming in the background. Morley based this illustration on some sketches he made during a February 1934 visit to Scranton, an area somewhere off Kaiser Avenue. So that's all for this one, and Melanie's going to talk more about company houses now.
So the artist who depicted this piece is very important to the Everhart Museum collection. Her name is Priscilla Longshore Garrett. She was born in New Jersey and lived in Westchester and New Mexico at different points in her life, but settled in Scranton during her most prominent years of painting in the 30s and the 40s. She had her first solo exhibit at the Everhart, facilitated by our then director, Elizabeth Taylor, whom she had a friendship with. She was also involved in many other exhibits hosted here over the years. She was not only an exhibiting artist here, but was also involved by donating many of her paintings, sketches, and artifacts she had collected over the years. She painted up until her death in 1992 and focused on a variety of subjects throughout her career, including figures, landscapes, portraits, and architecture. Garrett often revisited the subject of the coal industry, much like many artists who spent time in our region. Breakers and mine interiors are popular, but this piece, Garrett chooses to depict something a little less common, which is called a company town. These were small communities built by the employers of coal miners, lumberers, and railroad construction workers to house them and their families close to the job sites. This particular company town was in Duryea, Pennsylvania. The intention of these company towns was to promote wholesome living among the labor workers. The communities not only included homes, but also schoolhouses, libraries, churches, and stores. However, they excluded saloons or any businesses that the employer felt could have a negative effect on their workers' work ethic. That being said, there was a far more predatory reason behind the creation of these towns. They completely isolated workers and their families from other towns, cutting them off from access to other opportunities and jobs. Employers also owned all the stores in the community, which allowed them to raise prices, knowing that they had no threat of competing businesses taking their business away. This caused workers to go into astounding debt, which they would have to completely pay off if they ever wanted to quit their job or move out of the town. The grim reality of labor workers being exploited is an important underlying message in this already bleak depiction of the coal industry. So next, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a piece from the Kent Bicentennial portfolio. So this piece is by Jacob Lawrence, who, like Priscilla Longshore Garrett, was born in New Jersey but became established elsewhere as an artist. He grew up in Harlem, where he experienced the Harlem Renaissance movement at a very young age. This allowed him to develop his artistic language early, receiving acclaim as young as 24 years old. In this piece, Lawrence brings attention to the Great Migration, which he has a whole series dedicated to. The Great Migration was caused by segregation, rampant racism, no opportunities, and outstanding violence and lynchings of Black Americans in the South. The migration raised population dramatically in the North, with major cities like New York, Philly, Chicago, and Detroit raising by a collective 1,325% collectively. All of the reasons for migrating that I mentioned previously are topics that Lawrence addressed throughout his career and his work. This piece in particular shows migrants after their journey was complete, and depicts them in workwear and suits, empowered to exercise their right to vote in the North. While it can be said that this is a somewhat optimistic and even idealistic image, it also acts as a reminder of the widespread voter suppression that still takes place today, decades after the Great Migration took place, predominantly in Black communities. Let's go to Stephanie and see if you have any questions.
Thanks, Mel. So we actually had some really good questions. Marlene, we're going to revisit your question in a couple of minutes. The question for this particular artwork is, this person likes the artwork. Where can they find out more about Jacob Lawrence or artists like Jacob Lawrence?
Question, thank you. So Jacob Lawrence is a very well-documented artist. He's very well known. So thankfully there are a lot of resources on the internet that you can find about him. But I'm going to tell you a couple other museums who have work in their collections that you would be able to reach out to, and you could also reach out to us directly and we can tell you more about him. So he has pieces in the MoMA, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Whitney, the Met, and the Brooklyn Museum. And if you like Lawrence's work, you might also consider looking at Elizabeth Catlett, Glenn Ligon, or Faith Ringgold's work. Now we're going to go over to Mike to talk about a painting called Forest House.
Okay, this is an oil painting entitled Forest House. Okay, the title of this oil painting is Forest House, and it is named for the building here at the center. It says Forest House on it, which was the second hotel in the city of Scranton. It was located at Spruce and Wyoming Avenue, and it was erected in 1855. It served as a lodging for travelers and a meeting place and banquet hall for locals. Until recently, the museum had misattributed this work to a Joseph Searle due to misinterpreting the signature at the bottom of the canvas. While we were researching this exhibit, with some help from Sarah Puccini from the Lackawanna County Historical Society, we realized that the artist's name is actually Joseph Sewell, who was a commercial artist with a relatively unremarkable career. He mostly painted murals for department stores and vaudeville houses in Scranton, New York, and San Francisco. He painted Forest House as a commission for the owner of the Hotel German, the hotel that eventually replaced Forest House in the 1890s and is still there today. While we were reading about Forest House, I came across kind of a funny story in the Scranton Republican newspaper dated August 11th, 1891, and it has the exciting headline, "Yesterday was a hot day." And it read in part, "On the streets, men mopped their foreheads and women hid under spacious sun umbrellas. No one looked comfortable. At 3 o'clock, the thermometer on the thickly shaded Forest House porch," which I'm guessing is here, it registered 90 degrees, and fears were entertained by landlord Jacobus that the mercury would burst from the glass tube that imprisoned it. So there's a little slice of life for you. So I think we're going to go to Francesca now, and thank you.
So in the United States, the era of the American Revolution marked a really important moment in the development of our nation's national identity. The Founding Fathers, who were key figures during this time, became personifications of the origin of American nationhood and democratic culture. And thus, their images have been turned into symbols that represent this part of our history. Now we'll take a look at a series of 3 objects to discuss who has and has not been memorialized as an embodiment of American history. First, we'll take a look at this piece here, which is titled George Washington and Family. So this group portrait is a folk artist's attempt at rendering an original version by Edward Savage, which was a life-size group portrait of the Washington household. The portrait and its original represent a domestic representation of Washington in his home among family, rather than as a stoic seated portrait or depicting him in the battlefield, which was also pretty common. So this portrait also accomplishes another thing that we don't often see, which is establishing Washington explicitly as a slave owner. This painting, if you take a look behind Martha Washington, you'll see an African-American man. By most scholarly accounts, this man is identified as Billy Lee, an enslaved person in the Washington household. Billy Lee was one of Washington's most revered slaves. He was with him during most of his historic moments in American history, especially during the American Revolution. He is one of the only slaves to be named explicitly in Washington's will and played an extremely important role in the president's life and in American history, but we don't often hear about him. So Billy Lee is really a prime example of how African American men and women's contributions have often been overlooked historically. But fortunately, we have pieces like this that help to preserve this part of history. And I think we have a question, so we'll go to Steph.
Yes, two really great questions. I'll combine them. The first question is, who are the others in the portrait? And the second question is, why are their faces portrayed as angry?
Oh, it's a great question. So to the other individuals that are featured in this portrait, obviously the adult man is Washington and the adult woman is Martha Washington, his wife. But the 2 younger individuals, we have a boy and a girl, are actually Martha Washington's grandchildren, George and Eleanor. As to why they're painted with maybe a more stern facial expression, I think that might go back to why certain artists and people might have portraiture commissioned to depict them as stoic individuals. This is often how Washington is depicted in some of his other portraiture, so that might likely be the cause, but that's a fantastic question. So with that, we'll take a look at 2 of our next pieces.
So behind me, you'll see 2 presidential portraits depicting Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. These 2 portraits were painted by John Willard Rott, who was an Impressionist painter from Dormore, PA. Rott was most well known for painting landscapes, and he financed most of his career by actually doing commissioned portraiture, but usually of living people. But here we have 2 examples of posthumous portraiture that are recreated from original portraits done when both of these individuals were actually alive. They depict Washington and Lincoln in these redone portraits by Rott as idealized versions of themselves, a version that really establishes them as a symbol of the presidential office and the values of American democracy, not as the flawed and maybe complex and human individuals that they were. So when we consider what it means to be American, it's really important that we're able to grapple with the legacies of our historic leaders more truthfully. And by doing this, and also including some more underrepresented historical figures and their accomplishments, we are able to move forward as a nation. So it looks like we have another question, and I'll take it back to Steph.
Okay, so this is a great question. Pauline would like to know, what is the size of the painting, approximately?
Oh, the size of the painting. I would say maybe 3.5, 4 feet tall. But they're pretty standard sizes, nothing huge. If you can use me as a scale, I'm standing right next to them, and I'm about 5.5 feet tall. And any other questions?
Yes, there is another question. So this actually came in through email earlier, and John Lloyd-Wright is one of our most collected artists, so the question was, why did he choose to paint 2 American presidents?
That's a great question. So why would an artist choose to paint 2 people or recreate portraiture of people that are no longer living? It's a pretty common practice among artists to be able to test their own skills as artists to create or recreate such well-known work. And so portraiture, like Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, you've probably seen very similar images of this throughout your lifetime in many various places. So being able to reproduce something like this, keeping with key figures and key features, while also putting their own stamp as an artist, would have been just a test in their own artistic ability. So great question. So now, since we've gone through all 4 areas of the exhibition and we've explored some of the key pieces from our collection, I'll see if we have any standing questions for us to go through.
So we do have a few questions. The first question actually came in earlier. It was about the Cigar Store Indians, and it was from Marlene. She'd like to know, Francesca, if they're considered folk art.
Yes, so the Cigar Store Indians that we looked at earlier, the 3 wooden sculptures, we actually don't know who created each of those sculptures, which is pretty common for the area of folk art. Those pieces do fall into the standard typical features that you would see with folk art that Mel went into a little bit earlier when she dressed the child with flag. So they do fall into that category, but they do depict Native American peoples.
So another question just came in about the wrought paintings. Do you have any other wrought pieces on view in this exhibition?
In this exhibition, I don't think that we do, but we actually do have a semi-permanent gallery that displays a large portion of our John Willard wrought collection that's on display in the opposite wing of our temporary gallery. So if you're interested in seeing more of his landscapes, which we don't have included in this show, I would highly encourage you to make a stop in and take a look at that gallery space.
And I have one last question just to kind of wrap it up. So Francesca, what was your favorite, and your team, of course, curatorial staff here at the Everhart, favorite part of preparing for the exhibition?
That's a great question. I'd say, and I'll speak for myself, one of my favorite parts of putting any exhibition together is really taking the time to delve into researching some of the objects that we do end up selecting to make it into the final exhibition. While we do have varying levels of information about a lot of the pieces on display, we often do find out new and interesting facts about many of the works. Kind of like Mike had mentioned earlier about the information we were able to find out about Forest House. That's one of the really great examples of just being able to continuously learn while we're putting together a show for the public. Great. And if we don't have any other questions, it looks like we're coming to the end of our time. So as we conclude, I really just want to thank everyone who was able to attend and explore our exhibition from home. I hope you were able to learn something new and gain a new perspective on what it means to be American. I want to thank all of our speakers this evening for their expertise, and I also want to thank the crew from Posture Interactive for providing technical support. And one final thank you to PNC, our sponsor, who helped make this exhibition possible. Again, we are so glad that you were able to join us this evening, and we encourage you to continue exploring the exhibition. You can either download the Everhart Museum's app Or you can go to our website and click on our mobile guide under the Visit tab to explore a complete digital version of the exhibition. But we hope that you'll be able to come in person to see the exhibition for yourself. Our current hours are Saturday from 10 to 5 and Sunday from 12 to 5, and the exhibition will be on view through the end of the year. Again, thank you so much for attending. We hope you have a great rest of your night.